name is David Meyer, and I work at Shenandoah Conservatory. And I sing, and I teach singing, and I run the Jeannette Voice Research Center there. And my favorite quote of these presentations is from one of my favorite voice pedagogues, Marvin Kinsey, who says that information is only useful when it stirs our imagination or inspires our creativity. And so I begin with that. And what are we going to talk about? We've got four main points, and each one of the four is rather huge. An orientation into this crazy, wonderful, mysterious world of singing. And then number two is what voice teachers typically do, the kinds of diagnostics and processes and some generalities that voice teachers typically share. And number three is to look at the functional differences between classical and CCM singing, because if we try and do a study on the one and generalize it to the other, there are times when that might not be appropriate. And then number four is my own point of view, my plea towards our scientific colleagues of what we voice teachers need from you. This is, I think, Sten or Rahul suggested that. So it's a whole lot to cover. So orientation, why people sing and the nature of this beast, and then a few quick disclaimers. Singing is a very ancient part of being human. It probably predates speech, and we saw that these vocalization centers in the brainstem are much more primitive than things related to Broca's and Wernicke's area, are much further up in the cortex. So vocalizing and expressing emotion is limbic and ancient. Cultures going back to the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Mesopotamian cultures valued music as much as 3,500 BCE. And the oldest, this is something I'd love to see on a voice jury at a university. This is the oldest notated music that the internet provided me with, which was from almost 3,000 years old. So singing is a very old part of being human. And Oliver Sacks, who we recently lost, says that music in general, and I believe vocal music in particular, imprints itself more deeply on the brain than any other human experience. And I find that true. Bobby McFerrin has this really interesting demonstration of how the pentatonic scale in particular seems to be hardwired in our brain. And that's a very old scale. The oldest musical instrument was made from, I believe, a bird leg bone, and it's a pentatonic scale. But I just wanted to play a moment of that because it's amazing.
Expectations. What?
Ba, ba,
If you Google Bobby McFerrin and pentatonic scale, it's a really amazing demonstration. So one last word in orientation. I had the pleasure of sitting next to George Shirley at the gala here maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And many of us singers deal with this dilemma of what are we doing with our lives pursuing this aesthetic, which is often paid for by rich people. And George has this point of view, and I hope I summarize it both concisely and accurately, that this is one of the most important things that people do. And so Humans can only exist in community. When we were back in prehistory, we don't have fangs, we don't have armor. We need each other to hunt and gather and protect our young and survive. So we need to exist in groups, but we have a way of really ticking each other off in these groups. We have a way of doing things that fracture groups and tick each other off and anger each other. And when those groups fracture, we need some way of repairing those societal wounds, or else we reduce our chances of survival. And he believes, and I think there's a real chance that this is correct, that singing in particular helps us repair those wounds. And if you look at what happened at 9/11 as evidence of that theory, as soon as that horrible societal wound happened, one of our first responses as humans was to come together for this huge concert across continents with Sting and Billy Joel and U2, and to use music to start to heal those wounds. So take it or leave it, I find that a very helpful perspective. Singing teachers are skeptical of you all. You who try and codify and take and define the processes they use, they are skeptical of that because for hundreds of years they've done their thing. And so that's a logical skepticism. And there are other hard truths. Scientific and or functional teaching methods for the singing voice are not necessarily more effective at getting people to sing better. And I wish that wasn't the case because I'm a real nerd and I love the functional scientific point of view and it helps me deeply, but it's not necessarily beneficial. And the greatest singers in the history of this art have all been trained almost exclusively without the scientific tools that we're developing. This does not mean that creating a systematic method for building and organizing voice and singing voice pedagogy in a testable framework, that doesn't mean that's a ridiculous thing to do or impossible, but we aren't there yet. More on that in a little bit. And we have singerese. We speak a language, we singers do. I borrowed this cartoon from Peggy when she gave this presentation, but the soprano goes to the doctor and says, "Doctor, you've got to help me. My second passaggio is weak. I crack when I sing piano above F5. My mid-range is breathy with no core. My coloratura is all over the place and I can't find any mask resonance," right? We know sopranos like this. Some of us are sopranos like this. It's fine. And the doctor says, "You have erythema and edema of the arytenoids and some pre-nodular swelling in the striking zone and some ectasia on the superior surface of your left vocal fold and a little paresis on the same side. And how long have you had this horrible reflux?" So singerese is a fact, and the terminology is fluid, and the training is experiential, and that's fine. That's the way it is. There's not a problem with that, but we have to deal with that. So a few disclaimers. The information in the presentation that I'm going to try and give without running over is true and worthy of full acceptance and universally applicable to all of the singers, except when said information is incorrect or unhelpful. So just bear in mind that. And don't forget that singers are supremely variable in their needs. They're technical, they're artistic, they're personal, they're financial needs. They're all very individualistic, and they can very uniquely challenge and or frustrate their teachers. There's also too many slides for the amount of time that I have, and the slides have too much text. And some of the topics I'm going to cover are going to be too superficially covered, but it might be worth your time. Okay. So what do singing voice teachers do? They take a lot of information in the form of history and the intake with students. And they have a diagnostic framework, especially when they graduate from our program. Yes. And then I wanted to talk briefly about things that many of them have in common. So in the taking a history, the student comes in and we are taking in a lot of information about their instrument, about who they are, about what they're looking to do. There's a load of information coming in. And we try and talk about what brings you here, why are you here, who has encouraged you, what's your past background like, and we have them sing a piece typically. The four things that they can control seem like very few parameters for all of the art that they make. They can control loudness, pitch, vowel, and the register tone quality. And within those four components, the whole world of art can emerge. we train in our program, we train our voice teachers to think about what do I hear, what's going on with the sound, and then why is that happening? We're trying very hard not to just chase symptoms, but to really find out, I'm hearing this, why is it happening? And what purpose does that sound, does that quality serve? Because people aren't stupid, right? People will do something in a compensatory way. Many of the vocal faults that we address in the studio have very reasonable, logical reasons for being there. And we can chase the fault, or we can look for the underlying reason. And then what am I going to do about it? And much of this is a framework that we borrow from McKinney. The sound we tend to typically think is as a hyperfunctional, pressed, or a hypofunctional breathy sound, and there can be actually mixtures of the two. The register of the sound is a big deal, and this is something that I appreciated getting from Jeanie LoVetri in my work with her, is that the register is often one of the key places for the voice not doing what the singer wants it to do. And intonation and vibrato, of course. What's going on with their body? What's going on with their mind-body connection, and what are they singing? Are they trying to sing these Wagner songs, and they're finding it very difficult at 14 to do that? That's a piece of it, and that happens, actually. All right, register in general is a can of worms. The terms that I typically use, and that our students typically use, are head and chest and mix. And these are terms that go back almost 200 years, and they're imprecise, horrible, crummy terms that most people use. But register in general is a can of worms. And I have a special guest here to demonstrate head register tones, chest register tones, and we'll leave mix for another day. But this is Katie DeFilio, is one of our doctoral students. Katie. So, head register. These are extremes, but you get the idea? Okay, thank you, Katie. Okay. So register is a tricky place. We have trouble with the terminology, and people have been fighting at 45 years of Voice Foundation meetings over terminology. I don't have any interest in that. Sometimes the solution to terminology fights is to invent new terms, and so we have a proliferation of terms. We generally think of chest register tones as being thyroarytenoid dominant, and some of the EEG studies are showing us that the truth is not exactly as simple as we say it is, but that's not surprising. I'll skip that video, but there's, oh, it's only 29 seconds, let's go there. That's Let's start from the very beginning. That's a good place to start. So in head register, typically, and these are gross generalizations, typically we'll see mouth shapes that are relatively tall, and we don't see a lot of teeth, sometimes the upper incisors, but often we just see, and on chest or belt, you'll often have a very wide mouth shape where you see all the teeth, even to the molars, and that's to shorten the vocal tract and increase the bright timbre of the sound. And I'm happy to share slides, and we might have this on the web as well. Cricothyroid or CT dominant production, head voice, TA dominant, chest voice. Those are the ways we typically think about it. We also, in the voice studio, doing our diagnostic, we look at the body. Do we see obvious tensions? Do we see sternocleidomastoid or TMJ or jaw tensions? But we know from some of our motor learning colleagues that drawing attention to a tension will often make it a lot worse. You see that thing that you're doing that's tense, don't do that. Typically makes the tension a little bit worse, at least initially. And that's not surprising given some of our motor learning information. And body position symptoms, I believe, can often be caused by an underlying psychological struggle. Psychological struggles are very common for singers, and we have a stereotype of being kind of nuts in the musical world. However, consider that the singers are the only people in the world of music who are both the instrument and the player. Singers have their bodies as what they're using to perform with. How the singer perceives their own voice can be very easily damaged by people very early on. And the voice, above all other musical instruments, is deeply connected to identity. If you get a head cold, your speaking voice changes a little bit, and that can cause a very mild depression for people because their speaking voice is connected to their identity, and that changing can cause a little bit of a psychological reaction, which is ridiculous. You're the same person, you're the same brother, sister, but your speaking voice and your identity are so tightly mixed. And we know that building a therapeutic or a working alliance with your student is one of the highest indicators of how well your student is going to do. You can come at it from a Richard Miller point of view or from a holistic Granola Crunchy point of view, but that working alliance or that therapeutic alliance is going to correlate with their success more than any other single thing, despite the factoids you might learn in college. Oftentimes the repertoire is a problem, and students often don't know what a miracle cure transposition can be. Certain pieces can be transposed, but many can't. And Alma Gluck was a famous soprano who died in 1938, and she said there's so much repertoire out there, how can you possibly learn it? And that was almost a century ago. One of my other things that I owe Jeanie for is this concept of waiting for the bus. And if you go to one of her workshops, you'll see this come up frequently. But people in general, and you know this in your own lives, I imagine, they will reveal themselves if you're paying attention. If you're listening and tuned into who they are, they will usually reveal themselves. And in the same way, if the voice teacher is patient and resists the urge to give a lot of factoids or to do a lot of talking or to sound intelligent like they have all the answers, if they resist that ego-driven urge, which is not easy, and if they wait, the voice will usually reveal itself. But being comfortable with that uncertainty is difficult. And this is something I got from Jeanie and also from Kitty Verdolini, does this beautifully. Voice teachers typically work in one of these four modalities, and they move between them in a fluid way. They often use imagery, which sounds insane to non-practitioners, right? Imagine a pink fluffy cloud coming out of the top of your forehead. Sounds like total witchcraft, except sometimes crazy imagery actually is appropriate and helps the student. Kinesthetic, what you feel this buzz or vibration in this particular place, that can lead people into correct vocal production. What you hear, and also the functional or the scientific point of view, what your body is doing. And the really amazing teachers fluidly move between these modes, picking up on what's helping the student when. Those are the people who are fantastic. Some teachers come at their instruction with a one-size-fits-all hubristic approach that sells really well, but it doesn't help as many people. And I don't recommend it if that means anything, so don't do it. Richard Miller is probably the most important voice pedagogue of the last century, and he grouped singing teachers and characteristics into these 5 categories. He believes that oftentimes the problems with our singing are because we're compensating. We're doing one thing that's not working out well, so we'll overcorrect the daylights out of it and create a new problem. That's a common issue with singers, and I've been there myself. You have some teachers who are technically intense, and they organize their pedagogical framework into a very clear, precise group. So in your first year, you're going to work on these things. And that can be mechanistic, but can be very helpful. The flip side of that is the interpretation-based teachers who don't go into any organized framework like that at all. These people work well with natural singers or with singers who are over-controllers and over-focusing on their process. For many of them, they need that sort of approach. The technique mystique teacher, they have unique knowledge that no one else has. And if you don't go and study with them, you poor soul, because you'll never get it. But they aren't going to be at this meeting. And the one aspect teacher who believes that all vocal development rests on, and then insert breath relaxation. You know, posture is the one thing you need for singing. Or forward placement is the only thing you really need. And again, pedagogical balance is very difficult when you're focused only on one aspect of a very interconnected system. So Miller recommends that the perfect voice teacher to him has this balance between stability, which is a knowledge base that goes back centuries, and growth, which is coming to meetings like this and reading and increasing what you know, testing the new novel approaches so that you're not just following fads, but testing those against your own experience and intuition and clinical knowledge. And then combining that with musical intelligence and emotional intelligence and artistic intelligence and the ability to articulate that. That's Miller's ideal teacher, and I find a lot of wisdom in that approach. Okay, CCM versus classical singing. This is another can of worms. Are there differences? Because many people say good teaching is good teaching. You learn to sing opera so that you can sing anything else. You can sing death metal as long as you learn to sing opera first. Well, I don't agree with that. And the American Academy of Teachers of Singing put out a position paper saying that there are significant differences acoustically between classical and popular or CCM singing. And so it makes sense that teachers should tailor their instruction to help students achieve the styles of singing that they're interested in. The teachers need to know the wail of gospel or the twang of country or the rasp and rock and roll. Studying these different functions is just as important as knowing the difference between singing Wagnerian opera and Mozartian opera.
What does CCM stand for?
CCM stands for a number of things, but in this usage, sorry about that, it stands for Cleveland Conservatory Music, and it stands for Contemporary Christian Music. But the usage that is most common in the pedagogical world is contemporary commercial music.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We used to say non-classical, but to define something by what it isn't is kind of brain dead, right? So contemporary commercial music, and Jeannie, is that your term originally? Okay, so CCM is contemporary commercial, e.g. non-classical singing. And in Australia, they separate that out from musical theater, but we lump it all together in the States. All right, and this man said that there are many ways of, there are many styles other than classical Western operatic singing, and we in the voice world need to be aware of our cultural biases and not bring those into the clinic or studio with us. It's technically possible to sing all sorts of amazingly crazy sounds in a safe and idiomatically genuine manner. And yeah, we can help these people. I like that photo. Is he here? Don't tell him I have that photo. Okay. All right, so if you take as an assumption that there are differences between, functional differences between CCM and classical, I'm going to whip through these rather quickly. In breathing, classical singers use a low diaphragmatic breath, or at least they say they do, because what they say they do and what they actually do in regards to breathing aren't necessarily the same. This low diaphragmatic breath causes a tracheal pull. If you do a singer breath where you expand in your abdomen on the inhalation and put fingers on your Adam's apple, you'll usually feel your Adam's apple, depress slightly. That tracheal pull is going to make belting harder, because belting requires higher laryngeal positions typically than operatic singing. So if you're a classical teacher teaching this type of breathing to your musical theater kids, you might be causing them to have more difficulty than before they study with you. Musical theater singers have higher breathing often, and in the phonation, In classical singing, especially women, they use probably more CT dominant phonatory behaviors than the musical theater folks do. We think of, and we might be wrong about this, but we think of belting as a more TA dominant activity, whereas singing in classical head voice we think of as more of a CT dominant activity. Singers need to compete acoustically with the whole orchestra, whereas musical theater singers are almost always amplified, and the amplification is part of the instrument. Registration. In classical singing, we work hard to conceal the registration changes and create a legato line. And musical theater singers, they do something similar. They want to take the belt as far as they can without flipping all of a sudden into a sudden head voice. Legato is not necessarily as important. And in rock and roll and in pop singing, they'll often use those registration changes in a stylistic manner, like yodeling, for an emotional effect. I won't demonstrate. In vibrato, if you take one thing away, I know that pitches love vibrato. Classical singers typically have a constant vibrato from the beginning to the end of the tone, choral singing and early music notwithstanding. And in musical theater, if you go into a musical theater audition in New York with a constant vibrato, unless it's a very small part of the repertoire, you will be immediately discounted. They'll think you studied with an overly classical person, and those people are very quickly tossed out. In musical theater singing, you must be able to modulate your use of vibrato. And it's used as an ornament, often delayed at the end of a note, and in many pieces it's mostly eliminated. Resonation. We, classical singers, will sacrifice some vowel intelligibility to get an idiomatic, beautiful tone. And in musical theater singing, they will sacrifice the beautiful tone to keep the vowels speech-like and genuine. But they're only needing to move their voice 1 to 3 inches to a microphone, whereas we have to sing to the end of a hall. Singers in classical land, the head voice tones, Whitney Houston sang the same note in a headier manner and then in a chest or a chest mix. And again, the head tones are typically done with tall configurations which lengthen the vocal tract, and it's a different resonance strategy. And the belt or the TA dominant manner of singing is usually with, you see the teeth. And they're going for speech-like vowels in musical theater. Nasality is something we try and stay away from in classical singing, though sometimes we have more nasality than we know. And we have a presentation one of these mornings that deals exactly with this subject. Musical theater singers often will use nasality in training the belt or in finding a brighter edge to the sound. And classical singers, they need to be projecting their voices, whereas musical theater singers, they're amplified. They go for colloquial speech like genuine sounds. That sounds like you're talking on a melody. All right, what we need from you all, this is just my opinion, but I think I'm on with this. From the scientific community, what we could really use from you guys is something like a DSM for the singing voice. And I know there's other classification manuals in psychology, but a way of coming up with a nomenclature of categorizing different types of voices. So the DSM in psychology is used by people in all sorts of different clinical settings from different theoretical orientations. And we have loads of theoretical orientations in the singing world as well. But if we had a way of categorizing what singers do, this person is breathy but with some weird hyperfunction, so we would group them into this general group, then we might be able to start speaking with each other more easily and maybe even coming up with some sort of treatment studies. The DSM in psychology is used for clinical and community populations. They have the diagnostic classification, the criteria, and then the descriptive texts. And this won't probably happen in my lifetime, but it'd really be helpful to us in moving pedagogy forward. What we could really, really use are clinically useful real-time measurements of the singing voice. This could change the whole game. This could move us away from a Hippocratic mentor-student model. If we had CPP in real time, somebody, please, that would be my #1 Christmas request. If we could do Kestrel peak prominence like in real time so we can see a cursor on a scale moving around, then because the singer doing something and then analyzing it 5 minutes later is useful in a research context, but less clinically useful. Principles of motor learning are starting to come into our literature, and we need more of that. Motor equivalence is this theory where you can move a part of your body with a different muscle pattern than another person making the same movement. Does that make sense? So voice teachers say you need to do it this way. This is my orthodoxy. You do this thing that way. But the way the body works is maybe they don't do the right thing that way, and they're not wrong. But we voice teachers need to be careful about saying what's right and what's wrong. And drawing attention to a system will often degrade its performance. You see how you have that tension in your left bicep? Can you stop doing that? Will often make it tenser. Voice instructors, I just got like 4 more slides, so I see my blinking here. Voice instructors, we teach people, not voices. And so motivational interviewing has been a wonderful thing in my own clinical practice. And if you don't know what that is, Google it and get to know it if you're voice people. And Kitty Verdolini and Ava Van Leer both were instrumental in opening up that tool to me. And mindfulness training and concepts of mindfulness, especially Lynn Helding has written a lot about this, has been very beneficial. We need more of all this. And we need collaboration with you all. We need collaboration with neighboring fields to move our practice forward. And very lastly, singing voice pedagogy. We have centuries of tradition that are rich, and we look to you all for new tools. So if you'll consider that the first modern Olympics happened in 1896, right? And the world record track and field scores that people achieved in 1896 are today what high schoolers in mediocre programs typically achieve. And we as a species haven't evolved in 120 years significantly. There have been certain changes to equipment that have accounted for some of that, but in large part, the scientific method has helped advance our training to increase our performance. And that to me is really where the promise is and where I'm hoping you'll all help us go. Does that make sense? All right, and thank you. That's it.